Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Apartmentalist booth. My name's Igor. I'm the chief economist at Apartmentalist, lead our research and analytics teams. I'm super excited to be back at NAA with everyone here. And folks will trickle in, and it's going to be a fun time. We have about half an hour together. I always like using NAA as a chance to look back on the last year in the rental market and all the research we've done and all the things that we've been tracking, and also see kind of how far we've come and also what has remained the same. And so the goal for today, we're going to be talking about what I'm calling the big five. So what we want to do, there's so much data floating around there. I'm sure you all feel that your inboxes and your feeds are just swirling with different kinds of data storylines and opinions about the market. What I want to do today is just try to cut through that noise a little bit and just present kind of 5 trends you can kind of keep an eye on as we go forward throughout the next quarters, and we'll look back on it next NAA as well. What are those 5 trends? Some of these you probably know exactly where I'm headed, and some of these might be a little bit new, but we're going to talk about the rent roller coaster, the multifamily supply wave that I think a lot of us are surfing right now, something I'm calling new choices around new competition, the untethering of work and life, and then shifting location preferences of renters. I think these are the 5 things that if we keep an eye on through the next year, we're going to be in really good shape as we try to devise new strategies. So let's start with the rent roller coaster. When we started in the industry, what was typical rent growth for a year? 3%, 4% in a good year, 2% if things were slow. Whenever, the 2010s, like 3%, right? You can. Yeah, exactly. We don't have to talk about when we started. We have not yet had a typical stretch of rent growth in this decade so far, right? As the pandemic broke out in 2020, we saw rents in our data fall pretty precipitously, really driven by the large markets like San Francisco and New York throughout the country. And then this is where we started riding up the roller coaster, right? Getting ready for what was coming next, with the big explosion in housing demand in 2021, followed by a real quick cooling. This is when we rode the roller coaster down in the second half of 2022, going into 2023. Where are we today? We're still at a pretty cool time in terms of rent growth. We're tracking rents that are actually lower than they were at the same time a year ago. If I really want to butcher this roller coaster analogy, we're at like the part where you like splash through the water at the bottom after kind of like rolling through the high part, right? And so this is not necessarily something that we can take our eye off, because we're not in a normalized market yet. We're not reverting to 2010s era growth. We're really whiplashing back and forth between these different scenarios. When we take a step back and see what's happened throughout the pandemic era, we really see, I'm gonna get asked the question, what's happening with rent growth? Depends on your perspective, right? Rents are far higher than they were. Demand is still very strong relative to where we were before the real housing boom of the pandemic, but we're still down a few percent from peak rents. And here's where it gets interesting, though. There are really 2 different Americas when it comes to rent growth right at this moment in peak leasing season. We can almost draw this sort of growth L through the Mountain West and the Sun Belt. And that's where we've really been building a lot of new inventory, and those are the places where rents are actually falling pretty precipitously. We're seeing pretty fierce competition for renters, and renters are seeing a lot of options from new lease-ups. So when we look at the parts of the country with the slowest rent growth or the fastest rent declines, it's all Sun Belt markets. It's the Austins, it's the Atlantas, it's San Antonio and Orlando, Raleigh. These are also the places that are building the most. When we look at places where rents are growing fastest, we're actually seeing a lot of the top 10 power rankings for rent growth dominated by Midwestern markets. So you see places like Louisville and Milwaukee, Chicago seeing strong rent growth, Kansas City on the list as well. And so leasing strategies are really geography specific right now, because competition is very geography specific right now. And I think this is a really important factor as we go forward. There, the clicker's working. That makes me happy. We can see this on the vacancy side as well. We've seen vacancies increase in our data for every single month since October 2021, which feels like a long time ago now, right? We're talking Chicago NAA era. And so we actually, as we forecast this out forward, when we see how much construction there is in the pipeline, we don't see this coming down this year or really coming down too much next year. We're still going to be in a high vacancy environment, and that's really because of the next point that I'll talk about around the multifamily supply wave. This is a wild chart. This is just the number of multifamily units under construction in the US going all the way back to 1990. We see that in the 90s and 2000s, we weren't building as much multifamily. That was a real kind of single family sprawl boom time. Of course, everything fell off a cliff in the great financial crisis, but we've seen just a wild run up to basically 1 million units in the construction pipeline earlier this year. And this is coming down now, which means that these units are coming online faster than new units are entering the construction pipeline. So again, fierce competition is going to be a key theme. Why is that? We're just showing the number of multifamily units permitted. These are the think of this as units entering the pipeline. Again, we saw that basically 2021, 2022 were near record levels of permitting. This is a low interest rate environment. We were reacting to this big boom in the housing market as everyone played musical chairs in 2021 and early 2022. And the part of this that's maybe a little less expected is that it's also been taking longer and longer to build multifamily communities. They've been getting bigger. And throughout the pandemic era, we saw a lot of delays with labor shortages, supply shortages. And so we've got a lot of inventory that kind of bunched up together in the pipeline that's actually now really getting ready to hit the market. Now, when we forecast out completions, you might hear a lot about how, construction activity is drying up, interest rates are high. There's so much built up in the pipeline that we're still forecasting out a really healthy amount of completion, such that 2025 might look a lot like 2024 when it comes to a really supply-rich environment. And again, that's really going to be concentrated in those Sunbelt markets. So if you can find your favorite market on this chart, before you look, did you know what was the top builder on a per capita basis? Multifamily construction? Austin, Texas. It's booming like wow. Does anyone have communities in Austin? Oh yeah, Roger's in Austin. He's responsible for the heat. So we really see when we look at places like Austin, Dallas, Houston, Vegas, these are the places that are getting the disproportionate growth. And we are seeing that these units are getting absorbed because demand is also rebounding. Philadelphia is actually very interesting because apparently this little blip was like they got rid of a tax abatement. And so a bunch of developers were trying to squeak in units to the last second. So you see a little blip in the data there. But that's really where we're seeing the action. The Midwestern markets are seeing far less new construction activity. And so that is where you're still seeing the rent growth because the new supply is not pushing those rents down. So that's kind of competition within multifamily. I think it gets a little more interesting because, clearly we're going to be in a supply-rich environment 2024, 2025. We're going to have to get creative around exposure and opportunities. And I think there's a two-sided coin here that's really interesting to explore. Renter choices are getting much more dynamic. They're not just set on, I want to live in a multifamily community and I'm going to choose which one. They have a lot of options available to them. It's going to bring in more competition and also give us more hints on where we might find some interesting opportunities. So I want to go through this and kind of take a little step outside of multifamily for a moment. Kind of the old way of thinking was sort of like, okay, you have someone early in their life, they're going to rent for a while, and then they're going to go off and they're going to purchase their first home. That's getting harder and harder to do. Mortgage rates are really high, housing prices are still at peaks. Very hard time for first-time home buyers and especially older millennials. I think too much is made out of the competition between the rental market and the for-sale market. I think that's a really hard transition to make right now. Other places of competition are getting much more dynamic though. So I want to talk for a moment about single family rentals, living with family, and also short-term rentals as other considerations that renters are facing. So I mentioned over the next couple of years, we're gonna see these million multifamily units hit the market. We've got almost another 100,000 getting permitted for build to rent single family rentals. So this is trying to fill that gap in demand for those older millennials largely in some of those Sunbelt markets that are wanting a little more space, maybe different location choices. And so this is not at the scale, right, of multifamily rental development, but if you look at the growth over the last few years, it's quite striking just what a tear this trend is on. And so we'll talk a little bit about kind of what that means, and I think that kicks off an interesting conversation around how we can maybe also capture some of this demand and appeal to some of these renters as well. This is a trend to keep an eye on because there's going to be more, I think, competition between multifamily and single family rentals going forward. Here's a big one though. You know, 1 in 3 young adults live in their parents' home. We're not going to talk about what the census defines as young adults. That's not a favorable definition. But you know, I had a friend who worked at marketing for Red Bull, and he would always say, you know, we really are not thinking about competing with Monster and other energy drinks. We're trying to get shelf space from Coca-Cola. I sometimes feel like this is the multifamily's Coca-Cola to get shelf space from. You have this millions of young adults that are living at home that are on the boundary, and they can come out of the woodwork when conditions are right for generating new households that actually enter the rental market. There's this whole latent set of demand there that's kind of sitting on the sidelines that I think everyone needs to be thinking about how to activate. Now, a lot of people think this is purely an affordability story, and I think that's a big component of it, right? Rents are high. We've talked about the rent roller coaster, but as we've been unearthing some of the housing market data, there's another structural component that's very interesting here. This is a stat I only learned this past year. 61% of homes in the US have a spare bedroom. This is really, maybe this is just kind of a nerdy economist thing to get interested in, but we are home poor and bedroom rich in the US. You know, we know that we don't have enough homes. Estimates are that we're 1 to 2 million short of kind of where demand is escalating to be. But we actually have a lot of bedrooms, right? And so what are these bedrooms doing? They're actually soaking in a lot of potential renters to living at home in a way that is really affecting the broader housing market. Part of the reasons behind this, when you look over a long stretch of time, you see that homes have gotten much bigger and household sizes have really shrunk. And you look back at, 1970, there were, only half of homes had 3 or more bedrooms. But now almost 2/3 have 3 or more bedrooms. But what we see on the other side of the data is more and more people are actually living alone and in smaller households. And so the result is you have this big stock of potential housing in essentially spare bedrooms. Another wild stat that when you look at the owner-occupied housing, join us. Look at the owner-occupied housing throughout the US. 1 in 6 owner-occupied homes is occupied by seniors with 2 or more spare bedrooms. So young adults, they're not just looking at where am I going in the rental market, they're looking at what is the rental market going to offer me that's different or better than the home environment. And so this is a big opportunity for us to think about. There's also a big demand for flexibility among renters. Since 2020, 3.5 million renters have searched for a short-term rental on Apartmentalize. This is not, I don't want to make a comment about Apartmentalize. We're actually not necessarily known for short-term rentals, but increasingly renters are looking for flexibility. And I think the boundaries between the short-term rental market and the normal rental market or the long-term rental market, those lines are also blurring. So I think the point here is not an Apartmentalize specific point, but one about we need to be really careful when we think about other markets or other segments of real estate or other segments of rentals, because increasingly the overlap and the competition between them is growing. But that's also, I think, where we're going to find some of the hints on where we might find opportunities in leasing strategies, marketing strategies, because we see where renters are going when they're not going into traditional multifamily communities. Another trend that both drives this and is influenced by this is this untethering of where we work and where we live, or how we work and how we live. Traditionally, right, the biggest drivers of rental demand has been job growth. You know, how many new jobs are added in a local economy. That's usually driving how many new renters are going to be living there. But we're seeing something interesting happening where increasingly work choices and location choices are getting untethered. And I think this is actually, the point I want to make here is that this is really affecting the segments of Americans that are largely moving into multifamily properties. So this is a big deal for the US, but it's especially a big deal for everyone interested in this segment, in this conference. When we look at work from home rates by segment, 10% of households in single family rentals, or have someone working from home. In multifamily, it's 12%, but if we look at kind of Class A recently built multifamily, you actually see that almost double the penetration of remote workers are in the segment of essentially the new supply that's coming online today in our industry. So it's easy to look at it and say, okay, 1 in 9 employed Americans is working from home. It's actually much more, I think, when you look at your communities and when you look at the new people that are actually coming into the door of these communities. When you look at high income renters that moved in the last year of the census, 42% of them moved to a place where they were going to be working from that home environment. So I think that's a really interesting opportunity where there's a big overlap between segments that are drawn to newer premium multifamily and those that need different lifestyle arrangements and are more untethered from their work environment. And then we can all come up with strategies on how to capitalize on this. Is it more around kind of work campus-like environments? Is it different amenities? Does the walk-in closet need to become an office den? This is something to get a perspective around because there's a really interesting overlap in the Venn diagram of these demographics. But it's not just remote workers. This is another interesting trend around super commuting that we've actually tracked for a long time. Super commuters we've defined as those that commute 90 plus minutes each way to work. So you don't have to be a remote worker to live in a completely different place from your work. In fact, in the 2010s, we saw a really big rise in the number of super commuters where we added more than 1.5 million more super commuters throughout the US. And before the pandemic, we were looking at this and saying, wow, this is a real kind of untethering. There are affordability challenges that people are solving through living further out. Commute preference is becoming a much more important part of people's lives. We're seeing this untethering. Then, during the pandemic, what happened was that a lot of those people that were commuting 2 hours each way were saying, whew, thank goodness I can work remotely for a little bit. But what I want to point out is now they're coming back. And this is kind of a forgotten trend that's picking back up in the background that I think we also need to keep an eye on. But I think it's just very indicative of this broader force of the untethering of work and home. And so potential opportunities there because this is a real lifestyle shift and a market shift that's going to affect the industry in a big way. And finally, how are we doing on time? We're doing great on time. I want to talk a little bit about just shifting location preference because it's always worth, regardless of what renters say, it's always worth taking stock of how they vote with their feet and how that affects kind of the market outcomes that we see. And so I want to talk a little bit about shifting location preference. And I think I'm quite mindful of this because before 2020, we were really deep into researching kind of the re-urbanization of the American renter. A lot of young millennials at the time were disproportionately flocking to central business districts. It was the era where I think walkability and was the buzzword of all buzzwords at the time. And we've really seen a U-turn happen in this decade so far. One easy way to show that is when we look at rent growth by where people are relative to the core city in their metro. So what this shows, this is kind of a fun donut chart, but on the left panel we'll have rent change kind of in the first year of the pandemic. I think that's when we were very acutely aware of the challenges cities were having relative to suburbs. But I also want to show that it's actually persisted through to present day. So if we just look, what happened, we know that when the pandemic struck and the shelter-in-place ordinances came into effect, core cities became far less popular. And that's where we really saw those precipitous rent drops. 5% rent drop in core cities. But when you look in concentric circles further and further away from downtown, you actually saw stronger and stronger, actually positive rent growth, even essentially March 2020 through March 2021. I like to bring this up because a lot of, and by the way, economists were calling this the donut effect. There was a lot of discussion around what this means for the changing preferences of renters. But then people kind of stopped talking about this. But this donut effect is still very much there. And it reflects that the suburbanization of preferences has continued to play a really important role in how renters are voting with their feet. When we look at the 20% rent growth that we've seen nationally this decade so far, we actually see it's been far weaker in core cities, 12%. But when you look out, and you get to 15 to 30 miles from the core, all right, you're getting up near 25% rent growth. And the strongest rent growth we've actually seen more than 30 miles from the core within metro areas. Now, this doesn't mean if a community is in a core city, it's doomed, far from it. I think it's just important that as we look for leasing strategies, we're understanding how are preferences shifting? What can we get from an understanding of suburbanization of preferences that we can work into how we approach engaging our renters given how they're changing? This also plays out at the national level. This is just net domestic migration in the US. This is going to answer state by state, which states are Americans moving to on net and which states are Americans leaving on net. Again, you see this, the growth L in the US, which is basically the Sun Belt and the Mountain West, really dominating net domestic migration. I was surprised, do we have any South Carolinians in here? Or is that even the term for a South Carolinian? I was surprised to find South Carolina on a per capita basis is the fastest growing state through net domestic migration. That is, I don't know what's in the water there or what's in the barbecue sauce, but in aggregate numbers, it's definitely Texas, but on a relative basis, relative to the population, a lot of action in the Carolinas, a lot of action in Florida, a lot of action in the Mountain West. Now, the states where we're seeing domestic migration outflows, right, are largely the coastal, more expensive states. So we're talking California, we're talking New York. Now, immigration is a really important factor in those markets. So this is not going to take into account the boost that New York City, San Francisco, DC get from international immigration. But this is, again, a suburbanization of preferences at play, just not within metros, but across metros throughout the country. And we're going to continue to see this playing out as essentially the American renter largely moves south and west. So where does this go next? We're going to be tracking rents very closely because what we're seeing right now is a rebound in demand that's hitting a lot of new supply. And I think we're seeing that, I'm sure there's a lot of lease-up activity throughout the rental economy. I think that lease-up activity is very strong. There's a lot of new supply, but it's getting absorbed. And the question around rents and competition is both how long will this high supply environment last? I think we're expecting it to last at least through the end of next year. I don't think that was the expectation going into 2024. But the big X factor is going to be what happens with demand. Can demand really catch up with all the supply to drive more rent growth, or are we going to continue to see flat, anemic rent growth throughout the economy? I think as you're looking for new ideas, really interesting to look outside of the industry and think through the other segments of living and rentals that renters are choosing and seeing how can we interact with some of that potential demand. Markets that we sometimes talk about as separate segments really have a lot of overlap and a lot of opportunity in cross-pollination. We need to have a perspective on sort of what we're doing for the new class of remote workers and untethered employees. It's really interesting opportunities there. And then we're seeing that the suburbanization of preferences is continuing to play out. That was not just an early COVID effect. That seems to be the state of play in the 2020s rental market. So with that, I want to do a few things. I want to say a big thank you to everyone who attended. I want to plug, we have some amazing sessions coming up right here at the booth. We got Roy Baum, who's the product lead for Leah, our AI leasing product, talking about unlocking leasing success with generative AI. We've got the amazing Mike Wolberg talking about the AI power play, how that can really enhance renter experience. These will be kind of really great talks that are a bit more tactical than my very high level bird's eye economist view. So really encourage you to come back for those. And I think we do have a little bit of time for questions. I'd also love to stay around, but I really just want to say thank you, and I hope you really enjoy your NAA in the coming months ahead. Thank you.